How the true world finally became a fable, or how the real world finally became a myth, the history of an error. In this one page, half a page, page and a half, depending on font size and so on, Nietzsche puts a whole lot of information. It's like Plato's cave analogy, in that Nietzsche squeezes something like 1,000 pages worth of reflection into a few short paragraphs. In other respects, it's the exact opposite of the cave analogy. It's the anti-cave analogy. The cave analogy was all about the difference between the lower physical world and the higher immaterial world. And here Nietzsche is rejecting that difference, calling it an error, and tracing the error through the history of philosophy. The first three stages of this history are the Platonic, the Christian medieval, and the Kantian stages of the error. In each of these three, he first describes the error, and then he says something parenthetical which tells you which stage he's talking about. So first he says, in the first stage, the true world attainable by the wise, the pious, and the virtuous man. He lives in it, he embodies it. Then Nietzsche adds parenthetically, this is the oldest form of the idea. It's relatively simple, rational, convincing. It's a transcription of the proposition, I, Plato, am the truth. So first, he's talking about Plato. So this is the first stage in the history of the error. It's the idea of the higher immaterial world, and it's Plato's version of the idea. And Nietzsche has a sort of respect for Plato, because Plato has respect for himself. Plato thinks there's a higher world, and it's better than this one, and I can get to it because I am so wise, I am so smart, I am so virtuous, I am so noble. Nietzsche detests this idea of otherworldliness. The whole point of the Twilight of the Idols, indeed the whole point of all of his writings, is to expose, critique, and overcome this idea that there is a higher reality and that our world is less valuable than some higher world. And Nietzsche wants this world to be independent of a higher world. Well, he thinks it is independent, and he wants us to recognize that. And Plato, despite being one of the paradigmatic cases of this otherworldliness, Plato, Nietzsche thinks, seems to have something like a laudable self-respect, contrasted with the next stage, Christian medieval philosophy. The true world, unattainable at present, but promised to the wise, the pious, and the virtuous man, to the sinner who repents. Nietzsche adds parenthetically, progress of the idea, it becomes more refined, more insidious, more incomprehensible, it becomes feminine, it becomes Christian. Here we have the idea of the higher world, but it's made even more profoundly a symptom of weakness. And Plato's respect for himself as someone who can get to the higher world is now replaced by the Christian self-abasement. Nietzsche says, in the medieval view, the higher world is not attainable by the strong, wise, virtuous, noble, clever. The higher world is attainable not by those who are so good and can respect themselves for being so good, but by those who are not good, by those who have no respect for themselves. The self-effacing, penitent sinner is the one who attains the higher world in the Christian version of it, as Nietzsche is explaining it. And now the next stage in the history of this error. The true world, unattainable, undemonstrable, unable to be promised, but even as conceived, a comfort, an obligation, and an imperative. And if that doesn't tell you he's talking about Kant, the parenthetical remark will. The old sun still, but shining only through mist and skepticism, the idea becomes sublime, pale, northerly, Königsbergian. Königsberg is Kant's hometown, and the higher world grounds the categorical imperative in some crucial sense. Kant had said that the truth about God, about free will, and about life after death is a truth of the higher immaterial world, and we cannot access that truth, but we must believe in it. And so Kant says, knowledge of the higher world cannot be achieved. The higher world is unattainable, at least in this life, and we can't even promise it in the next. But the idea of the higher world is ethically necessary, and Kant says we need to believe in this higher world in order to live ethically in this world. And Nietzsche says this is the old sun, referring to Plato's old analogy of the sun for the good which sits atop the immaterial world. The ultimate of immaterial reality in Plato's Republic is the good, and its metaphor is the sun. And Nietzsche says here of Kant that Kant is still working with the same old idea of the Platonic sun, only unlike Plato, he's saying we can't get there. We glimpse it through mist and skepticism, and the idea has become sublime, pale, northerly, Königsbergian, and he means the word Königsbergian both as a reference to Kant and as an insult to Kant. And now we have three moments after Kant. First is the effects of Kant, where Nietzsche says, the true world, unattainable, at any rate unattained, and being unattained, also unknown. Consequently also, neither comforting, saving, nor obligatory. What obligation could anything unknown lay upon us? What obligation could anything unknown lay upon us? Nietzsche says that the Kantian idea has this effect, that it makes the idea of a higher world completely useless. Parenthetically, he adds, grey morning, first yawning of reason, cock-crowing of positivism. We have finally a hint of, well, as Nietzsche sees it, a hint of hope. The realization that the higher world is a useless idea, given that Kant said it is unattainable. Nietzsche is applying something like Occam's razor, or exactly Occam's razor to Kant. If there is no access to this higher reality, why should we believe in it? If there's no evidence of it, why should we believe in it? If there's no knowledge of it, why should we believe in it? And if there's no knowledge of it, evidence of it, or promise of it, why say that this higher world is useless? What obligation could anything unknown lay upon us, says Nietzsche. And so the response to Kant comes up next. That was just the effects of Kant. Now, the response they call for is the fifth moment in the history of an error. Nietzsche says, the true world, an idea neither good for anything nor even obligatory any longer. An idea become useless and superfluous, consequently a refuted idea. Let us do away with it. If an idea is useless, we should get rid of it. Let us do away with it. Full day, breakfast, return of good sense and cheerfulness, Plato blushing for shame, infernal noise of all free intellects. Oh, there's so much here. There's a reference to Milton. Full day, breakfast. This is the elimination of the idea of the higher world because it's become useless. Let us do away with it. Let us get rid of the idea because Kant made it useless. And Nietzsche thinks this is a moment of great optimism. But there's a question of something that seems like despair, but it is a despair that must be overcome. Sixth and final moment in the history of the error. We have done away with the true world. What world is left? Perhaps the seeming, or perhaps the apparent world. But no, in doing away with the true world, we have also done away with the seeming world. Noon, the moment of the shortest shadow, end of the longest error, climax of mankind, incipit Zarathustra. Now, this means, first of all, in a standard illustration of the higher world and the lower world, of metaphysics according to the idea of philosophical assent and the idea of otherworldliness, you would have the higher world and then you would have the lower world, and you have a dividing line between them, perhaps the dividing line of Plato's Republic, the middle books. You'd have the lower reality and the higher reality. 1, 2, higher, lower, lower, higher. And of course what Kant does is he makes this line between the two an impenetrable barrier. And so Nietzsche says, well, if you can't get from here to here, just get rid of here and just accept that we have here. But on this kind of an illustration of the principle, you'd have a label here which says higher world, and you'd have a label here which says lower world. Well, now you just have the world. We've abolished the lower world. Once the higher world is gone, the lower world is no longer the lower world. We've abolished that modifier lower. So in one aspect of this passage, we simply have the optimistic moment of erasing the modifier lower and just recognizing this as the world. It's not the lower world, it's just the world, and it's a good world. And in Kipit Zarathustra, here is a reference to Nietzsche's literary character Zarathustra, who proclaims anew this worldly existence, a prophet of life affirmation, or an anti-prophet, but someone teaching affirmation of life in this world. And there's more here. There is a hint of something like despair. What world is left? Perhaps the apparent world, but no, we've also done away with the apparent world. Well, you could read that as meaning we've done away with the modifier of apparent in the apparent world. True world, apparent world. Higher world, lower world. We get rid of the higher world, it's gone. All we have is the lower world. Well, we would just remove the modifier lower, and we have just the world, and it's good. Real world, apparent world. True world, seeming world. We've gotten rid of the true world, now we have the apparent world. We remove the modifier apparent, and we just have the world, and it's a good world. But there also seems to be something like despair. Something like darkness, something like pessimism. Because, he says, we have done away with the seeming world. You might say we're not only erasing the modifier seeming, or the modifier lower, or the modifier apparent and leaving the world, we're erasing the whole lower world along with the higher. Well, I think Nietzsche does want us to think of that. And he wants us to think of that because he thinks we're already thinking of it. Because we, like Kant, like Plato, like Christian medieval philosophy, have grown accustomed to thinking that the value of the lower world depends on the value of the higher world. And so when we eliminate the higher world, we've eliminated the value of the lower world. Atheism breeds nihilism. That's the idea. Materialism breeds nihilism. That's the idea. Nietzsche thinks we have this idea, and so he wants us to confront this darkness, this pessimism, this abolition of the lower world along with the higher world. And confronting this darkness is exactly what Zarathustra is doing. But Zarathustra also wants us to move beyond it. So we have both senses of this notion that in doing away with the true, we have also done away with the seeming world. The dark sense. We've erased the world. The whole world is gone. There's no meaning left in life. But there's also the other sense. All we really need to do is understand that we've erased the modifier lower, the modifier seeming, the modifier apparent. Now there's just the world, and it's a good world, and it's a beautiful world, and it is independent of the higher. Now, what shall we say about this? Shall I say something about this? What should you say about this? Well, first of all, this is what Nietzsche says. Understand that that is what Nietzsche says. I said in the last video that there are those, such as Meryl Westphal and Jean-Luc Marion, and I count myself among them in this respect, those who are religious philosophers who have a certain appreciation for Nietzsche's critique of modern religion. Because religious people, even if they're Christians, are not necessarily immune to idolatry. The Apostle Paul, forbidding the idolatry which covetousness is in the New Testament, is a sufficient point to demonstrate that. Well, what Nietzsche is doing is he's trying to expose our intellectual idols. Now, his response to this is, of course, that we should reject these ideas of God, and full day, breakfast, noon, the moment of the shortest shadow, cheerfulness, recognize the independence of this world from the higher world, the goodness of life, affirm the beauty of life without reference to the higher world. In Kipit Zarathustra, Nietzsche wants an affirmation of life without reference to the higher world. That's his atheistic, humanistic, positive, optimistic response to the problem of modern idolatry. I think we are free if we are religious. In fact, maybe I should say we are free if we have good reasons for disagreeing with Nietzsche on the key metaphysical point. We are free to accept his critique of an idolatry, of any false religious ideas that ring hollow, any religious ideas that are, as he says, useless. A higher world, unattainable, unknowable. What's the point of that? What obligation could anything unknown lay upon us? Get rid of these ideas. They're just idols. But if you have reason to believe in the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, you don't have to ditch all religion along with the idols. And this is the way that Westphal and Marion go, and I tend to agree. And now, reducing a lot of this to a single metaphysical statement, rather a metaphysical question. Nietzsche thinks that this world is independent of a higher world. This world does not need God. Well, compare and contrast that with Augustine in, for example, book 19 of his book on the City of God. Not only Augustine, of course, you could find this in any number of philosophers and theologians, but Augustine's a great one. Book 19 of the City of God. Augustine argues that we do need God. This world does need God. Is this world independent of God or not? Is this world independent of the higher world or not? That is the ethical and the metaphysical question that confronts us in response to Nietzsche. And if the answer is yes, then probably Nietzsche, or something very similar to Nietzsche, is the right way to go. But if the answer is no, then we go Nietzsche's way at our peril.